The alien woman laughed at human genetics. Until she became pregnant instantly. Part 1 of 5. The Dawn of Reason was a big ship, but it never felt big. It was full of sounds, the hum of machines, the soft beep of monitors, the quiet voices of people from different worlds trying to work together without getting in each other's way. Dr. Leon Carter had been on the ship for 3 months now, and he had learned one important thing: the Vreth did not think much of humans. Leon was not the kind of man who got angry about things like that. He was 34 years old, calm by nature, and had spent most of his adult life studying biology across species. He came from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the sky was wide and the pace was slow, and he had carried a little of that slowness with him even into deep space. He worked in the ship's genetic research lab, a long white room filled with screens and sample cases and the kind of quiet that serious work requires. His partner, Dr. Priya Osman, sat across from him most days, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes quick and sharp behind her glasses. Priya was from Houston and had a gift for reading situations before they fully formed. She had noticed the Vreth attitude toward humans on day 1 and had said so plainly. Leon had nodded and gone back to his data. The Vreth were tall. They had silver skin that caught light in a way that made them look like they were always standing in a museum. They had 6-chambered hearts, brains with backup systems, and a history of biological science that stretched back 4,000 years. They were proud of all of this, and they had reason to be. Their science was real. Their record was long. Commander Ziyara Vel was the best example of all of it. Ziyara ran the Vreth side of the research program. She was precise in everything: the way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she reviewed data on her screen with her long fingers barely touching the surface. She had written 14 academic papers on interspecies genetics, all of them well regarded in the cooperative. She was polite to Leon the way a professor is polite to a student who shows some promise, not unkind, but clearly aware of the distance between them. The research mission was about genetic compatibility. Specifically, the project was trying to understand how much 2 different species could interact biologically before something went wrong. It was careful, measured work. Leon's job was to map the passive sequences in human DNA, the parts that did not seem to do much, the long stretches of code that researchers had called junk for decades. Most of his colleagues in the cooperative agreed that these sequences were evolutionary leftovers. Noise in the signal. Leon did not agree. He had spent 2 years looking at those sequences before the mission started, and he had a feeling about them, a quiet, careful feeling, the kind that a scientist does not say out loud until he has data to back it up. He kept looking. He kept taking notes. Priya noticed a change in his posture one afternoon, the small shift that meant he had seen something. She looked up from her own work. Leon was staring at a string of data on his screen with the focused stillness of a man who has just heard a sound he cannot identify. He told her he thought the passive sequences were doing something. Not randomly, something structured. Like a language, he said, or something close to one. Priya asked what kind of language. He said he did not know yet. She told him to be careful about how he framed it before he had more to work with. He said he knew. 2 weeks later, the joint crew held a presentation session. It was standard: every research lead gave a short talk on their current findings. Leon stood at the front of the room and presented his data. He kept it plain and clear. He said that the human passive sequences showed signs of a structural pattern that might allow them to interact with external biological systems in ways that had not been studied before. He said the sequences might be capable of reading and responding to other species' biology. He used careful words. He did not overclaim. The room was quiet when he finished. Several of the Vreth scientists exchanged looks. Then Ziyara spoke. She thanked him. She said the data was interesting. Then, in a voice that was completely even and not unkind, she explained why his hypothesis was not possible. She talked about the Vreth reproductive system specifically, 17 biological steps, all under conscious control, all requiring deliberate hormonal activation. She said that no external genetic material had ever triggered that system without the host's active participation. Not in 4,000 years of recorded science. She said the idea that human DNA could somehow navigate that architecture was, and she paused here for exactly 1 moment, charming. Someone in the room laughed. Then a few others. Ziyara did not laugh, she simply smiled, the way a person smiles when they have made a point clearly and they know it. Leon nodded. He said he understood. He sat down. Priya watched him from across the room. His face was still. His eyes were clear. She knew him well enough to know that still and clear meant something specific, it meant he was not done. That night, Leon sat alone in the lab and pulled up the recording of the session on his screen. He watched Ziyara's response again. He listened to the laugh. He did not flinch at it. He opened a new file and began quietly redesigning a portion of his study. He did not change his hypothesis. He changed his method. He made it tighter. More rigorous. Harder to dismiss. Before he left for the night, he saved the file and labeled it simply, Round 2. In the corridor outside the lab, the ship hummed steadily around him. Somewhere in the upper deck, Ziyara Vel was probably reviewing her own notes with the clean confidence of a scientist who already knew all the answers. Leon walked back to his quarters, unhurried, thinking about the long stretches of code that everyone else called junk. He did not think they were junk. He had never thought that. And somewhere in the quiet part of his mind, in the place where a scientist keeps the things he is most sure about, he was certain he was right. The alien woman laughed at human genetics. Until she became pregnant instantly. Part 2 of 5. The containment breach lasted 11 seconds. That was the number in the incident report that Leon filed the next morning, 11 seconds. A micrometeor had clipped the outer hull sensor array, caused a brief power fluctuation across Deck 3, and the bio-isolation field in Lab 2 had dropped. The field was back up before the alarm finished sounding. The automated cleanup system moved in immediately. Both genetic sample sets were sealed. The lab was cleared, documented, and returned to standard operation within the hour. Ziyara filed her own report at the same time. She noted the breach, the duration, the cleanup protocol, and marked it as resolved. She did not think about it again. Leon did not think much about it either. He had other things on his mind. The new version of his study was moving well, and he had found 2 more data points that supported his original hypothesis. He was careful not to get excited too soon. He just kept working. 6 days passed. On the morning of the 6th day, Ziyara woke up tired. Not the normal tiredness that came from long hours and close quarters, something deeper, a heaviness behind her eyes that rest had not touched. She sat on the edge of her bunk and counted her breaths the way breath medicine taught. The tiredness did not move. She told herself it was the recycled air on the ship, or the pressure of the current research phase, or any of the 10 reasonable things it could easily be. She went to work. She reviewed her team's overnight data. She attended a morning coordination meeting with Admiral Cole Hensley, who ran the ship with the steady, unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough in his career to know that panic was almost never useful. She answered 6 messages from the Vreth Council's Science Committee. She did all of this well, because she always did everything well. By midday, she noticed something else. There was a warmth behind her sternum, low and steady, like a coal that had been burning for a while without her realizing it. She pressed 2 fingers to her chest the way she had done since childhood, a small Vreth habit, a way of checking in. Her heartbeat was not wrong. But it was different. The 6 chambers were moving in a rhythm she did not fully recognize, not irregular, not alarming, just new. She told herself it was nothing. On the 8th day, the biomonitor flagged an alert. Every Vreth officer wore a biomonitor as standard equipment. It was a thin band at the wrist, barely visible, and it tracked the body's internal state with the precision that Vreth engineering was known for. Ziyara felt the alert before she looked at it, a soft vibration, 2 pulses, the signal reserved for readings that required immediate attention. She looked at the screen. The monitor told her that her body had begun the 17th biological trigger sequence. Ziyara stood very still in the middle of the corridor for a moment. Then she walked quickly back to her quarters and sat at her desk. She read the monitor's data again, slowly, with the careful eye of someone checking for an error. The 17th trigger was the final step in Vreth conception. There were 16 steps before it, 16 separate hormonal activations, each one deliberate, each one requiring a conscious decision from the host. The Vreth reproductive system had been this way for as long as their medicine had records. It did not happen by accident. It could not happen by accident. But the data said that all 16 preceding triggers had already fired. Ziyara did not remember initiating any of them. She sat quietly for a very long time. Then she stood up, checked the corridor outside her quarters, and walked to the medical bay. It was the middle of the afternoon shift. The bay had one medic on duty, a young human named Gary Cole, who was reading something at the front desk. Ziyara told him she needed to use the diagnostic suite for a private scan. He showed her to the suite and left without asking questions, which she appreciated. She ran the first scan. The result was not ambiguous. She ran the scan again. Same result. She changed the diagnostic setting, adjusted 3 parameters, and ran it a third time using a protocol designed for breath biology specifically. Same result. A fourth time. A fifth. Every scan said the same thing. Ziyara sat in the diagnostic suite for a long time after that. The room was small and white and very quiet. The monitors blinked steadily around her. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she looked at her hands. Then she opened her personal data pad and pulled up the recording of Leon's presentation from the research session. She fast-forwarded to the part where he had described the passive human sequences, the part where he had said they might be able to read and respond to other species' biology. She listened to his voice, careful and plain, laying out the data. Then she listened to herself. She heard the pause before the word charming. She closed the file. She did not sleep that night. She spent the hours until morning running every alternative explanation she could construct, working through each one with the full force of her scientific training. She was thorough and she was honest, and by the time the ship's lights shifted to signal the start of the morning cycle, she had eliminated every explanation except one. The 11 seconds. The breach had lasted 11 seconds. The isolation field had dropped. The genetic samples had made full contact. And somewhere in those 11 seconds, the human passive sequences had done exactly what Leon said they might do. They had read the architecture of her biology, learned its language, and moved through all 16 triggers faster than any conscious system could have stopped them. Ziyara sat at her desk as the ship came to life around her. She was a scientist. She had built her career on following data wherever it went, even when it was uncomfortable. The data had never taken her somewhere like this before. She picked up her pad. She opened a new document. At the top, she typed the date and the time. Then she began to write down everything, in order, from the beginning. If this was real, and 5 scans said it was, then it needed to be documented. Precisely. Completely. Without any gap that someone could question later. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. Then she closed the document, set the pad on her desk, and thought about Leon Carter. The alien woman laughed at human genetics. Until she became pregnant instantly. Part 3 of 5. She waited 2 more days before she told him. Those 2 days were the longest of Ziyara's career. She kept her schedule exactly as it always was. She attended meetings, reviewed data, answered messages. She was precise and composed and gave no one any reason to look at her twice. But inside, behind the stillness that she had trained into herself over decades of scientific work, something was moving that she did not have a name for. It was not fear, exactly. She was not afraid of the facts. She had never been afraid of facts. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a map, at the line where the known world ended and the blank space began. On the 10th day after the breach, she walked to Leon's lab. It was early, the morning shift had just started, and Priya had not arrived yet. Leon was at his bench, reviewing overnight data on his screen. He did not hear her come in. She stopped in the doorway for a moment, looked at the back of his head, and made a decision. She walked in and closed the door behind her. Leon turned around. He saw her expression, not the polite, careful expression she wore in meetings, but something underneath that. He did not say anything. He waited. Ziyara told him there had been a development related to the containment breach on day 3. She said it in the measured tone she used for difficult information. She laid it out plainly, the breach, the 11 seconds, the sample contact, the symptoms she had noticed, the biomonitor alert, the 5 scans, and the conclusion that every scan had returned. She watched his face while she talked. Leon listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, very quietly, if she was all right. Ziyara had not expected that to be the first thing he said. She had expected a question about the data, or a request to see the scans, or some form of the told you so that she had been bracing for across 2 days of waiting. Instead he asked if she was all right. She told him she was functioning. He nodded. He asked if she wanted help figuring out what had happened. She said yes. What followed was the first genuinely equal conversation they had ever had. Leon pulled up his data on the passive sequences. Ziyara brought her biomonitor logs and the scan results. They spread everything across the shared screen in the middle of the lab and looked at it together, and for the first time neither of them was the expert and neither of them was the student. They were just two scientists looking at something that had not been seen before. Leon walked her through the structural pattern he had found in the human passive sequences, the part that had felt to him like a language. He showed her where the pattern appeared, how it repeated, how it shifted slightly each time as if it were adjusting to something. He had thought it was adjusting to environmental signals. Now, looking at her biomonitor data, he had a different idea. Ziyara pulled up the internal record of Vreth reproductive trigger architecture, the sequence of 17 steps, each one with its own hormonal signature. She overlaid it with Leon's sequence pattern. The alignment was almost immediate. The human passive sequences had not randomly encountered Vreth biology. They had read it. They had mapped each of the 17 triggers in order, identified the correct hormonal signal for each one, and activated them in sequence. 9 seconds. That was how long the trace analysis showed it had taken. Leon stared at the overlay for a long moment. He said it quietly, 9 seconds. Ziyara said nothing for a moment. Then she said that her body had not registered anything until 6 days later. The triggers had all fired before her conscious biology had any chance to notice them, let alone respond. Leon said that made sense. He said the sequences had not forced anything. They had just moved very fast, in the correct order, using the correct signals. He paused and then said it was like someone had unlocked a door by learning the exact combination faster than the lock could reset. Ziyara looked at the overlay on the screen. She had spent 4 years in university studying Vreth reproductive biology. She had published on it. She had stood in front of a room full of researchers and explained, with complete confidence, why it was impossible for any external genetic material to move through that system without deliberate activation from the host. She said, slowly, that she had been operating on the assumption that the architecture's complexity was itself a barrier. Leon said that it probably was a barrier. For most things. She understood what he meant. The complexity was a barrier for systems that tried to push through it. The human sequences had not pushed. They had listened first. Priya arrived at the lab about an hour into this. She opened the door, saw the two of them standing side by side at the shared screen, saw the nature of the data on display, and went very still for a moment. Then she quietly set her bag down, poured herself a coffee, and sat at her own bench without asking any questions. She had the rare quality of knowing when not to speak. Leon and Ziyara worked for 4 hours. They built a detailed trace of the entire interaction, the moment of contact during the breach, the movement of the human sequences through the Vreth biological architecture, the timeline of each triggered step. They cross-checked everything twice. When they were done, the picture was complete and there were no gaps in it. At the end of those 4 hours, Ziyara sat back from the screen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she owed him a correction. Not just a note in the research record, a real one. The kind that acknowledged that his hypothesis had been right and that her public dismissal of it had been wrong. Leon said that the data was more important than either of their positions on it. She said that was true, but that it did not change the fact that she had laughed at him in front of their colleagues. She said she did not like being the kind of scientist who laughed at a hypothesis she had not fully tested. Leon said that he had not taken it personally. Ziyara said she knew that. She said that was one of the things she had found difficult to categorize about him from the beginning. He did not take things personally, but he also did not let things go. He had just kept working. Leon said he had not known what else to do. Across the lab, Priya took a slow sip of her coffee and looked at the ceiling. She did not smile, but it was close. Ziyara went back to her quarters that evening and opened the document she had started 2 days earlier. She wrote for another hour, adding the details of the joint investigation, the trace analysis, the complete mechanism. Then she sat for a while and thought about what came next. She knew she would have to report this. The Vreth Council had protocols for significant biological events. She was a senior officer and she had no choice. But before she did any of that, she opened a separate file. She had started writing something else, not a report, not a log. It was taking the shape of a paper. A scientific paper, co-authored, that laid out everything they had found. She had not asked Leon yet. She thought he would say yes. She typed his name in the author line. Then she sat back and looked at it for a long time. The alien woman laughed at human genetics. Until she became pregnant instantly. Part 4 of 5. Admiral Cole Hensley had been in command of the Dawn of Reason for 2 years. Before that, he had run 2 diplomatic transport missions and 1 deep space survey. He was 56 years old, from Portland, Oregon, and he had a face that had been worn into a kind of permanent patience by years of managing situations that did not come with instruction manuals. Ziyara requested a private meeting with him the morning after she and Leon completed the joint trace analysis. She sat across from him in his office, which was smaller than people expected a commanding officer's office to be, and she told him everything. She was precise and complete and she did not soften any of it. When she finished, Hensley was quiet for a moment. He looked at the surface of his desk. Then he looked back at her. He asked what she needed. She told him 2 things, privacy and time. She needed to complete a paper before word of this reached the cooperative's general network. If this information moved without proper scientific context, without a documented mechanism and verified data, it would become something that neither of them could manage. Hensley said he understood. He told her she had both. He also told her that he was going to have to note the incident in the ship's command log. He had no choice about that, but that he would frame it as an ongoing medical and scientific review until she was ready. She thanked him. As she stood to leave, Hensley said one more thing. He said that in his experience, the events that changed things were almost never the loud ones. They were usually something quiet, in a small room, that nobody was paying attention to when it started. Ziyara looked at him for a moment. Then she said she was beginning to understand that. She contacted Elder Voreth that same afternoon. Voreth was ancient, no one on the Vreth Council knew his precise age, and he did not offer it. He had the long silver face of a Vreth who had spent centuries in positions of authority, and his voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Except that he was surprised now. Ziyara could hear it underneath the flatness. She laid out the facts for him the way she had for Hensley, carefully and completely. When she finished, the line was silent for longer than Voreth usually allowed silences to last. He said that what she was describing was not possible. Ziyara said she understood why he would say that. She said she had said the same thing herself, in public, to the men whose hypothesis had predicted it. She told him that the data had not changed its mind to match her opinion, and that she had therefore changed her opinion to match the data. Voreth said that the council would need to review everything before any information was released. He said this was a matter of significant sensitivity for the Vreth people. Ziyara said she had anticipated that, and that she was completing a full scientific paper with verified data, co-authored by the human researcher involved. She said the paper would be ready within 5 days and she would send it to the council before it was submitted anywhere else. Then Voreth said the part she had been expecting. He said that this was an embarrassment. He did not say it with cruelty, he said it with the heavy, disappointed tone of an elder who had built a long career on certainty, and who now had to look at a crack in one of the walls he had trusted most. Ziyara did not agree with him. She said, quietly and firmly, that it was not an embarrassment. It was a discovery. She said the council could decide whether it wanted to spend its energy understanding what had happened or defending a position that the evidence no longer supported. She said she knew which one she was going to do. Voreth ended the call shortly after that. The paper took 6 days to finish. Leon and Ziyara worked on it in the evenings after their regular research duties, sitting across from each other at the lab bench with their screens side by side. Priya helped with the structural editing. She had a gift for making dense scientific language readable without making it less precise. The paper was 37 pages. It included the full trace analysis, the mechanism, the timeline, the biological data, and a section at the end that laid out the implications for how the cooperative understood human passive genetic sequences going forward. They submitted it to the Council and to 3 cooperative science networks simultaneously, on the same morning. The response was large and fast. Leon and Priya sat on the ship's observation deck that evening and watched the message traffic come in on Priya's datapad. She read the responses aloud. A genetics institute on the Vreth home world requested an immediate full data share. 2 human universities sent congratulations that were so enthusiastic they were almost embarrassing. A cooperative council member from the Karath species submitted a formal inquiry asking whether human genetic material should be reclassified in the cooperative's biological registry. A journalist network asked for an interview. Then another one. Then 4 more. Leon drank his coffee and stared at the star field outside the window. He looked mildly overwhelmed, in the way of a man who had expected to be right about something eventually but had not fully planned for what right looked like at this scale. Priya read him a review from a Vreth academic named Dr. Selvorin, who had published alongside Ziyara before and who wrote that the paper's mechanism section was the most significant contribution to interspecies genetic theory in 40 years. Then she read him a response from a human blogger who had titled his post "Humans are secretly genetic wizards" and had gotten 300,000 reads in 6 hours. Leon put his head in his hands. Priya laughed. In her quarters, Ziyara was reading the response from the Vreth academic community alone. Most of her colleagues had written carefully, in the measured tones of scientists trying to process something large. Some were clearly unsettled. A few were openly resistant, and their responses had the particular texture of people who were angry not at the data but at what the data meant for things they had believed for a long time. Then she found a message from a woman named Dr. Era Ben, someone Ziyara had studied alongside 20 years ago, before their careers had taken them to different parts of the cooperative. The message was 3 sentences long. It said, "I heard you at the conference in 2381, when you talked about Vreth genetic integrity. I thought you were right then. I should have been paying more attention to the human researcher in the back of the room who disagreed with you." Ziyara read the message 3 times. Then she set the pad down and looked out the small window of her quarters at the dark between stars. She thought about 2381. She thought about the researcher in the back of the room. She did not remember his face. She remembered being confident. She remembered the room agreeing with her. She picked up the pad and began writing her response to Dr. Ben. It took her a while to find the right words, which was unusual for her. She was good with words. But this was a different kind of writing, not the clean language of science, where everything had a defined meaning and a correct form, but something older and harder. She wrote that she had also been paying insufficient attention. She wrote that she was correcting that now. She sent it and closed the pad. Outside the window, the stars held still. The alien woman laughed at human genetics. Until she became pregnant instantly. Part 5 of 5. The child was not like anything in the Vreth medical records. That was the first thing every specialist said when they reviewed the data, not with alarm, but with the careful, wide-eyed tone of a person looking at something they had never been trained to see. The genetic profile was not a blend in the simple way that word usually meant, where 2 things are averaged into something in the middle. It was something else. The Vreth sequences were fully present. The human sequences were fully present. And between them, in the places where the 2 sets of code had touched and recognized each other, there were structures that belonged entirely to neither. Leon called them bridge sequences when he first saw them. Ziyara said that was not a precise scientific term. Leon said he knew, but it was accurate. She looked at the data for a long moment and then said she would allow it, for now. The pregnancy moved forward day by day. Ziyara documented everything, every reading, every developmental marker, every variation from standard Vreth patterns and every variation from standard human patterns. She was thorough in the way she was thorough with everything, which meant absolutely. Leon reviewed her documentation each morning and added notes from the human biological side. They had developed a rhythm without ever formally deciding to. He brought 2 cups of coffee to the lab now. She had stopped pretending not to notice. Priya watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen something coming long before it arrived. She did not say this out loud, because she was smart enough to know that the thing she had seen coming was not exactly what had happened, and that the truth of it was better than any version she had predicted. The cooperative continued to respond to the paper. An international genetics working group was formed. 3 universities on 2 different worlds announced new research initiatives specifically focused on human passive sequences. The Vreth Science Council issued a formal statement acknowledging the findings. It was measured and careful and said very little beyond acknowledging them, which was itself significant. Voreth did not contact Ziara again for several weeks. When he did not mention the paper or the council's statement. He asked how she was. She told him she was well. He said he was glad. There was something in his voice that she had not heard from him before, not quite humility, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a very old certainty quietly making room. 6 weeks after the paper was published, Sayara stood at the front of the ship's main assembly room and gave a talk to the full crew. She had not been asked to give it. She had requested the time. Hensley had put it on the schedule without asking why, because by now he had learned that when Sayara Vel requested something, there was a reason, and the reason was usually worth hearing. The room held 42 people. Humans and Vreth and 2 Kareth observers who had joined the ship as part of the new cooperative review process. They sat in rows and watched her take her place at the front. She did not use notes. She stood straight, the way she always stood, and she talked for 25 minutes. She told them what she had believed before the mission started. She described the presentation, the hypothesis, the laugh. She did not soften it or excuse it. She said she had heard something she did not expect and she had responded to it the wrong way, because her confidence in what she already knew had moved faster than her willingness to look at new data. She said that was a failure of scientific practice, and that she held herself to the same standard she held every study she had ever published. Then she talked about what she had found. She described the passive sequences in human DNA not as primitive and not as superior. She said those words directly, because they were the words that had been used, and she wanted to retire them properly. She said the sequences were something she had not had an accurate category for before. She said they were the biological expression of a certain kind of patience, a code that did not shout, did not compete, but waited and listened and learned. She said that in 9 seconds, during 11 seconds of unplanned contact, those sequences had done something that 4,000 years of Vreth biological science had said could not be done. And they had done it without forcing anything. Without breaking anything. They had simply asked, in the right language, at the right speed, and the answer had been yes. The room was very quiet. She said she thought the cooperative had been using the wrong tools to study human biology. She said they had been measuring it against the standards of other species, looking for what it did that other biologies did better, and concluding from that comparison that it was behind. She said they should have been asking a different question: what does human biology do that nothing else does at all? She said the answer, based on the evidence in front of them, was that it reached quietly, without announcement, into systems it had never encountered before, and it found a way to belong to them. No one spoke for a moment after she finished. Then Admiral Hensley, from the back of the room, began to clap. The rest of the room followed. Afterward, Leon found her near the window at the side of the room, looking out at the star field. He stood next to her and said it had been a good talk. She said his original hypothesis had been poorly formatted. The introduction had needed work and the conclusion had understated the implications. He said he knew. He had been aware of that at the time. She said that despite this, the hypothesis had been correct. He said he was glad someone had confirmed it. They stood at the window for a while. The stars outside were very still, the way stars always are from a distance, even when they are burning. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes and neither of them moved to leave. It was the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. Somewhere in the ship's research archive, in a folder that would eventually be accessed by scientists across 4 worlds, was the paper they had written together. 37 pages. 2 names at the top. It would be cited in research for the next 200 years, referenced in textbooks and lectures and debates that neither of them would live to hear. It would change the way the cooperative classified human genetic material. It would open new fields of study. It would be the thing that a generation of young scientists would point to when they talked about the day the question changed. In Zayara's personal copy of the paper, saved to her private data pad, there was a note she had written on the night she sat alone in the medical bay with 5 identical skin results in front of her. She had written it before she had told anyone, before the joint investigation, before the paper, before any of it. She had written it in her own careful hand, in the small space at the bottom of the first page. It said, He was right. Next time, listen before you laugh. She had never deleted it. She did not intend to. Outside the window, the Dawn of Reason moved steadily through the dark, carrying its crew of 42 across the space between stars, going somewhere none of them had been yet.